October 1856, Eastern Texas. Along a wooded stretch near the banks of the Brazos River, a patrol of mounted men rode slowly beneath low branches heavy with Spanish moss. The air was thick, unmoving. One of the horses refused to step forward, nostrils flaring. What the riders found moments later would circulate in whispers across plantations and frontier towns for decades. The bodies of 2 slave hunters, their weapons missing, their dogs gone silent, and no clear sign of who had turned the hunt back on its pursuers. 1856, this region was a volatile edge of the expanding United States. Cotton profits were rising, and so were tensions. Enslaved men and women were bought, sold, and transported through river corridors and dirt roads cut into dense timber. Runaway notices filled newspapers. Slave patrols operated with broad authority, often composed of local men familiar with the land. Professional slave catchers, sometimes called slave hunters, moved between counties, tracking escapees for reward. The 2 men found near the river were identified as Gideon Harrow and Thomas Kearley. Harrow was 41, originally from Mississippi, described in tax rolls as a stock dealer, though locals knew his trade extended to recovering escaped slaves. He was methodical, known to keep small journals with dates, distances, and names. Kearley, younger by nearly a decade, had served briefly in a county militia. He had a wife and an infant son in a settlement 20 miles south. Neighbors later recalled that Kearley disliked the work but needed the pay. Their most recent assignment began 3 weeks earlier on the Wilcox plantation, where 4 enslaved men, Samuel, known as Sam, Isaiah, Ben, and a teenager called Josiah, had disappeared after nightfall. The plantation ledger noted missing tools and a mule. No signs of struggle were found in the quarters. The overseer reported that Sam, in his early 30s, was literate, a rarity that fueled suspicion he had been planning the escape for months. Isaiah was older, quiet, regarded as steady. Ben had been sold twice before arriving at Wilcox. Josiah was barely 17. The plantation owner offered a reward that doubled if the men were returned within 2 weeks. Harrow and Kearley accepted the contract. They brought with them 2 tracking dogs and basic provisions. According to Harrow's recovered notebook, the hunters traced the men northward along the river, likely using shallow water crossings to disrupt scent trails. The entries noted broken reeds, a discarded scrap of cloth, and boot impressions that suggested at least one of the escapees had acquired sturdier footwear than plantation-issue shoes. On October 14, Harrow recorded a brief line, "Camp signs, fire pit concealed, they are learning." It was the last full sentence he would write. The first major reveal came not from the bodies but from a small canvas sack found several yards away. Inside were iron shackles, unlocked. It was standard practice for slave hunters to carry restraints, yet these showed no sign of use. Their keys were missing. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. The discovery of the bodies occurred 2 days after Harrow's final note. A farmer named Elias Boone, checking his trap lines near the river, noticed the dogs first. They were tethered to a sapling, alive but dehydrated. Boone followed the disturbed brush to a shallow depression where the men lay. Both had been shot with their own rifles. Powder burns suggested close range. There were bruises on Kearley's wrists consistent with binding. Harrow's jaw was fractured, possibly from a blow delivered before the shooting. Local authorities assembled a small posse. Sheriff Daniel Mercer of Brazos County arrived within hours. Mercer was known as practical, cautious. He ordered the area cordoned and documented what he could, though formal forensic practice was rudimentary by modern standards. The rifles were found unloaded beside the bodies. Tracks were visible but overlapping. At least 4 distinct barefoot impressions were identified near the riverbank, along with 1 partial boot print that did not match either hunter. Witness reactions were divided. Plantation owners insisted the escapees had ambushed the hunters. Some townspeople speculated involvement from outside agitators, though no evidence supported the presence of abolitionist operatives in that remote region. A few enslaved individuals later interviewed under duress claimed to have heard that Sam had once worked as a blacksmith's assistant and understood firearms better than most assumed. Sheriff Mercer's report listed three primary possibilities. First, the four escapees overpowered the hunters during a confrontation, seized their weapons, and executed them to prevent pursuit. Second, a third party encountered both groups and used the confusion to eliminate the hunters. Third, a dispute between Harrow and Kearley escalated, with the escapees intervening afterward. Mercer noted that the final theory lacked supporting evidence but did not dismiss it outright. Examination of the campsite a half-mile from the bodies revealed signs of a struggle. One overturned kettle, trampled grass, and a length of rope cut cleanly with a blade. Blood was found on the rope fibers, though not enough to indicate fatal injury. The mule taken from Wilcox Plantation was discovered days later, wandering without saddle near a creek crossing. Its reins had been cut. Interviews conducted in surrounding settlements added complexity. A ferryman recalled four black men approaching the river at dusk approximately a week before the bodies were found. He claimed they did not attempt crossing, but asked questions about patrol routes. Another resident reported hearing gunshots on the night of October 15, though he assumed they were hunters pursuing deer. The most revealing testimony came indirectly. An enslaved woman on a neighboring property, known in records only as Clara, later recounted that she had overheard Sam speaking weeks earlier about turning the dogs around. According to Clara's statement, Sam believed that if cornered, they would have to fight, not flee. The authenticity of her account is difficult to verify, given the coercive conditions under which such statements were often obtained. Mercer's posse tracked footprints northward for nearly 12 miles before losing them in rocky terrain. No further confirmed sightings of the four men were recorded in county documents. However, in early November, a traveler passing through a small frontier settlement near the Red River reported encountering four black men traveling together at night, armed, avoiding main roads. The description loosely matched Sam and his companions. No arrests followed. Physical evidence from the scene suggests the hunters were surprised. Harrow's notebook was found closed and placed beneath his body, as though he had been pushed backward while seated. Kearley's hands bore splinters consistent with struggling against wooden restraints. The angle of the gunshot wounds indicated the shooter stood several feet away, possibly after forcing the men to kneel. The absence of additional gunfire marks implies controlled use of ammunition. Contradictions persist. Why were the dogs left alive? A strategic choice to slow pursuit or evidence of haste? Why were the shackles left unused yet unlocked? Some historians argue the keys may have been taken deliberately, preventing future recapture if the men were later apprehended by others. Others contend the unlocked shackles suggest the hunters were preparing to restrain someone when interrupted. Sheriff Mercer filed his final report in December 1856. It concluded that the four escapees were armed and dangerous, and presumed responsible for the deaths. Bounties were posted but never claimed. No bodies matching their descriptions were found in subsequent months. Plantation correspondence indicates heightened patrols and stricter night watches across the region following the incident. The broader social context cannot be ignored. By the mid-1850s, fear of organized resistance among enslaved populations had intensified. News of uprisings elsewhere, even exaggerated rumors, traveled quickly. The idea that four enslaved men could successfully reverse a manhunt unsettled the established order. For slave catchers operating in remote territories, it introduced a new calculation of risk. What became of Sam, Isaiah, Ben, and Josiah remains uncertain. There are no confirmed records of their capture or return to Wilcox Plantation. One theory proposes they reached Indian territory, blending into frontier communities where identification was less rigidly enforced. Another suggests they continued northward, though the distance and danger would have been considerable. As for Harrow and Kearley, they were buried in separate plots near their respective home settlements. Harrow's journals, preserved by a relative, end abruptly with that final note about concealed campfires. Kearley's widow petitioned the county for financial assistance, citing his death in the line of civic duty. The petition was partially granted. In the years that followed, the incident was referenced quietly in plantation discussions as a cautionary tale, sometimes framed as evidence of growing lawlessness, other times as proof that desperation can shift the balance of power, even briefly. The official record names it simply as a double homicide connected to runaway slaves, yet the sparse documentation leaves gaps large enough for speculation. 2 armed men entered the woods to retrieve 4 others considered property under the law of the time. Days later, those hunters lay dead, their weapons taken, their pursuit ended. Whether the escapees acted in self-defense, premeditated resistance, or a calculated bid for freedom cannot be conclusively established from surviving evidence. What is documented is the reversal itself, a deadly manhunt that did not end as intended. The forest reclaimed the campsite within months. River levels rose and fell, erasing tracks, but the case file, thin as it is, preserves a rare moment when the hunted altered the outcome. In October 1856, along a quiet stretch of Texas riverbank, the expected order fractured. And in that fracture lies a mystery that has never been fully resolved. Winter settled over eastern Texas in the closing weeks of 1856 with a damp cold that pressed low across the river valleys. By then, the official search for the 4 escapees had slowed, but it had not ended. Notices remained posted in market towns. Riders still carried descriptions folded into coat pockets, and in plantation ledgers, their names were marked not with death, but with absence. Sheriff Daniel Mercer reopened portions of his inquiry in January after receiving a letter from a trader traveling between settlements near the northern frontier. The trader claimed to have seen 4 black men working discreetly for a small cattle operation west of the Trinity Corridor. According to the letter, one of them read from a newspaper aloud to the others by firelight. The detail was specific enough to draw attention. Mercer dispatched a deputy to verify the claim. The deputy's report returned inconclusive. By the time he arrived, the cattle outfit had moved. No employer admitted to hearing fugitives. Several ranch hands stated they had seen unfamiliar men weeks earlier but could not confirm identities. Tracks in the winter mud suggested a small group had indeed camped near a creek bed, but time had degraded clarity. The deputy noted something else: no signs of theft or violence in the area. If the 4 men were present, they had not caused disturbance. Meanwhile, examination of Harrow's final notebook pages continued. Though brief, the entries revealed a shift in tone during the last days of the pursuit. Earlier notes were confident, measured distances, steady progress. In the final 2 entries, his handwriting tightened. Words crowded margins. They split and rejoin, he wrote on October 12. Signal patterns, bird calls on October 13. Not frightened, watching. These observations suggested the escapees were not simply fleeing in panic. They were adapting, possibly coordinating. Mercer considered whether someone local might have provided guidance, perhaps a free black resident familiar with the terrain, or even a sympathetic laborer willing to share information quietly. However, no formal evidence supported organized assistance. Attention turned again to the physical evidence from the riverbank. The iron shackles found in the canvas sack were examined more closely months later by a blacksmith in town. He noted fine scoring along one hinge pin, as if someone had tested its weakness previously. It was unclear whether that damage occurred before or during the incident. If the escapees had anticipated capture, they might have studied the restraints in advance, understood how they functioned. The dog's condition also drew reconsideration. Both tracking animals survived and were later returned to a handler. According to his statement, the dogs had not been beaten. They were tied securely with deliberate knots. This detail carried weight. Killing the animals would have prevented further tracking. Leaving them alive but restrained could indicate limited ammunition, or a conscious decision not to waste it. It also implied time, enough to secure the animals carefully without immediate threat. In February 1857, a traveling preacher passing through a settlement near the border of Indian Territory recounted an encounter during a sermon. He described meeting 4 men in the woods weeks prior, who asked him about northern routes and river crossings beyond Texas jurisdiction. He claimed they carried 2 rifles and moved cautiously, but did not threaten him. The preacher insisted they spoke calmly, one of them quoting scripture from memory. He did not know their names. He did not report the meeting immediately. Sheriff Mercer documented the account but could not verify it. The distance from the original site of the killings made the timeline plausible but uncertain. If accurate, it suggested the group remained intact at least a month after the manhunt reversed. Plantation correspondence from early 1857 reflected unease. Several owners referenced the October incident indirectly, describing increased boldness among enslaved workers. Patrol frequency doubled in some counties. Curfews tightened. Ironically, the violent deaths of 2 hunters, intended to deter escape, may have signaled that resistance carried potential success, however rare. There were no public trials, no captured suspects displayed as warning. The absence of resolution became its own disturbance. Families of Harrow and Kearley pressed for definitive answers. Harrow's relatives speculated in private letters that he had underestimated his targets. Kearley's widow wrote that her husband had feared the woods during his final week, though this recollection surfaced months after his death and may have been shaped by grief. One additional piece of evidence surfaced in spring. A trapper discovered a rusted rifle barrel partially buried along a tributary north of the original site. The serial markings matched one of the hunter's missing weapons. The wooden stock was gone, likely repurposed for firewood or dismantled. The barrel showed signs of intentional damage, bent slightly near the muzzle. Whether this act was symbolic or practical remains unknown. Disabling a recognizable weapon would reduce traceability if encountered later. By mid-1857, official pursuit ceased. Records shifted focus to other cases, other runaways, other disputes. The file regarding Harrow and Kearley closed without arrests. The 4 escapees were never formally declared dead, though plantation inventories eventually replaced their labor with new purchases. Their names faded from ledgers as transactions overtook memory. Yet in scattered oral accounts preserved decades later, fragments of the story endured. An elderly rancher interviewed in the 1890s claimed that as a child he had seen 4 armed black men traveling at night along a ridge, moving north with deliberate pace. He remembered his father telling him not to speak of it. Another account from a former enslaved man, recorded after the Civil War, mentioned hearing of 4 who turned the hunt around and walked free. Names were not provided. Verification remains impossible. What can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence is this. In October 1856, near the Brazos River in Texas, 2 experienced slave hunters were overtaken during pursuit. Physical evidence indicates they were subdued, restrained, and shot at close range. 4 enslaved men had motive to avoid recapture at any cost. Subsequent reports suggest a group matching their number and description continued northward in the weeks that followed. Beyond that, certainty dissolves into possibility. They may have crossed into Indian territory and integrated into frontier settlements where documentation was sparse. They may have continued further, toward states where slavery's reach weakened, or they may have succumbed later to violence or hardship beyond the record. The river kept its silence. The forest erased detail. But the reversal remains documented, a rare instance in surviving records where those pursued seized control of the encounter and disappeared into uncertain freedom. In the quiet margins of county archives, the case still rests unresolved, a fragment of 1856 that resists closure. By the summer of 1857, nearly 9 months after the bodies were found near the Brazos, the case no longer occupied public discussion in eastern Texas. New disputes, new escapes, and the ordinary violence of the frontier replaced it in conversation. But within official correspondence, the file was not entirely dormant. Sheriff Mercer received a circular from authorities in northern counties warning of increased movement of self-liberated enslaved people attempting to pass through toward Indian territory. The circular referenced armed parties traveling in groups of 3 to 5, often avoiding settlements and relying on river corridors for navigation. No names were attached, but the description was consistent with what Mercer had already documented. He reviewed his earlier field notes once more. One detail, previously considered minor, began to carry weight. At the original campsite, located roughly half a mile from where Harrow and Kearley were found, there had been 2 separate fire pits, not one. The ashes in one pit were older, cold for at least a day before the confrontation. The second pit contained fresh embers. This suggested the escapees had camped in that area for longer than initially assumed, possibly observing the hunters' movements rather than merely being surprised by them. If that interpretation was correct, the balance of control during the final hours shifted further. It meant the hunted may have chosen the location of confrontation. The terrain there was uneven, bordered by thicket and shallow marsh. Visibility was limited to less than 30 yards in most directions. A mounted approach would have been slowed. Dogs could track scent, but in wet ground and heavy undergrowth, accuracy declined. Mercer also reconsidered the rope fibers found at the scene. Early analysis described them simply as cut cleanly. Months later, under better light, he noted that the fibers were not frayed as from panic cutting. They were severed at a single angle, consistent with a sharp blade applied deliberately. It implied composure during a violent encounter. In October 1857, exactly 1 year after the killings, a letter reached Brazos County from a trader operating near the borderlands beyond formal Texas jurisdiction. The trader claimed to have heard of a small group of black men working under assumed names on a cattle drive farther west. He wrote that one of them carried himself like a man who had led others before. Again, the report was indirect. Again, no confirmation followed. It is important to note that 1856 and 1857 were years of mounting instability in the United States. Political fractures deepened nationally. Violence over slavery expanded in other territories. News traveled by newspaper, by rumor, by itinerant preacher and merchant. Within that climate, stories could shift in retelling. The case of the reversed manhunt may have grown in quiet legend as it moved beyond its original geography. Yet certain physical facts remained unchanged. 2 men entered wooded terrain armed, mounted, and accompanied by trained tracking dogs. Days later, they were found dead, disarmed, and restrained. Their equipment showed signs of being used against them. No additional bodies were discovered nearby. No evidence suggested outside gunmen beyond the 4 originally pursued. One overlooked element concerned ammunition. Harrow's supply pouch, recovered at the scene, contained fewer cartridges than it had when he departed the Wilcox plantation, according to his inventory list. However, no expended casings matching his rifle were located near the campsite. This raised the possibility that shots had been fired earlier during pursuit, perhaps during a warning exchange not documented. It also suggested the final confrontation may not have begun with gunfire. Kearley's fractured jaw indicated blunt force trauma before his death. Combined with bruising on his wrists, it supports the theory that the hunters were physically subdued prior to being shot. 4 against 2 would have offered numerical advantage if the escapees acted in coordination. The dogs, though capable, could be neutralized if their handlers were incapacitated quickly. By late 1858, the case file was transferred to county storage. Mercer retired shortly thereafter. His successor made no new entries related to the incident. Plantation ownership in the region shifted in subsequent years as national tensions escalated toward war. After the Civil War ended in 1865, Fragments of testimony emerged during Reconstruction-era interviews with formerly enslaved individuals. One account, preserved in a local archive decades later, described hearing of 4 men who would not be taken alive and turned the guns back. The speaker did not claim direct knowledge. The statement was offered as part of a broader reflection on resistance and fear in the years before emancipation. There remains no definitive record confirming whether Sam, Isaiah, Ben, and Josiah survived long-term. No census entry conclusively matches all 4 traveling together in subsequent decades. That absence does not prove failure. Frontier documentation was inconsistent, especially for Black men adopting new names. What the archive preserves with certainty is the rupture itself. The expectation in 1856 Texas was clear: escape would end in recapture or death. In this instance, the immediate outcome defied that expectation. The hunters did not return. The pursued were not displayed in chains. The official pursuit yielded no arrests. In the wooded stretch along the Brazos where the confrontation occurred, seasonal floods eventually altered the riverbank. Any remaining physical trace vanished. But within county ledgers, within private letters, and in quiet recollections passed down through families, the event endured as an anomaly, a deadly manhunt reversed in a landscape that rarely allowed such reversals. The final page of the official record contains no dramatic closing statement, only a line written in steady ink: perpetrators not apprehended, case inactive. Beyond that line lies uncertainty. 4 men stepped into the forest seeking freedom. 2 men followed with intent to return them in chains. The forest yielded only half of that story. In the years that followed, the physical landscape along the Brazos shifted with floods and drought, but the social landscape of eastern Texas shifted even more dramatically. By 1860, census records show population growth across the region, an expansion of cotton acreage, and a corresponding increase in the enslaved population. The Wilcox Plantation, from which the 4 men had fled in 1856, recorded the purchase of 6 additional laborers within 2 years of the incident. The ledger entry that once listed Sam, Isaiah, Ben, and Josiah was marked through with a single diagonal stroke. No notation of recovery, no date of death, only absence. When the Civil War began in 1861, many local patrol structures dissolved as white male populations were drawn into military service. County records from Brazos and adjacent jurisdictions became sporadic. In that administrative disruption, older unresolved cases, including the killing of Gideon Harrow and Thomas Kearley, slipped further into archival obscurity. Yet the memory of the incident did not vanish entirely. In 1867, during Reconstruction, a federal Freedmen's Bureau agent stationed in Central Texas compiled reports concerning pre-war violence. Among them is a brief mention of 2 slave catchers killed in pursuit of 4 bondsmen, perpetrators never recovered. The agent did not expand on details. The line appears as context, illustrating the volatility of the period rather than reopening the investigation. One detail, however, emerges indirectly in a deposition taken in 1868 from a formerly enslaved blacksmith living near the Trinity Corridor. He described, without naming individuals, hearing of a group that had studied restraints before fleeing. According to his testimony, the men had examined iron cuffs weeks before escape, discussing how hinge pins might be removed if necessary. The blacksmith stated that such knowledge circulated quietly among enslaved laborers who worked near workshops. The deposition does not confirm that the 4 from Wilcox Plantation possessed this expertise, but it aligns with the scoring observed later on the shackles found near the bodies. The implication is measured but significant. If the escapees anticipated capture not as a distant possibility but as a near certainty, preparation would have been practical, not symbolic. Studying the mechanics of confinement, learning the weaknesses of iron, understanding how tracking dogs operate, these are not acts of panic, they are acts of planning. In 1872, More than 15 years after the deadly confrontation, a ranch ledger in western Texas recorded wages paid to a laborer, identified only as Samuel I. The initials stand without explanation. The ledger lists him as literate and capable of handling accounts during cattle drives. No birthplace is noted. No prior status recorded. It is impossible to confirm whether this individual was the same Sam who fled in 1856. But the detail is consistent with earlier descriptions of a literate man among the escapees. Equally ambiguous is a church registry from a small settlement near the former Indian Territory border, listing a marriage between an Isaiah B. and a woman identified as Clara in 1874. The names echo those connected distantly to the 1856 file, yet documentation from that era is fragmented. Similar names were not uncommon. Without corroborating data, such entries remain suggestive rather than conclusive. The families of Harrow and Kearley followed separate trajectories. Harrow's personal effects, including his final notebook, remained with a nephew who later donated them to a regional archive. The pages bear water staining and smudged ink, but the final entries are legible. Kearley's son, born months before his father's death, enlisted in a Texas cavalry unit during the Civil War. He survived the conflict and lived into the early 20th century, reportedly avoiding discussion of his father's occupation. By the 1880s, as Texas modernized rail lines and expanded commerce, the 1856 incident had become less a legal matter and more an anecdote, shared selectively. In some retellings among white settlers, it was framed as evidence of growing lawlessness before the war. In oral traditions among black communities, references appear more restrained but pointed, a story of four who resisted capture and vanished northward. No official reopening of the case occurred. No exhumation. No forensic re-examination. The original burial sites of Harrow and Kearley remain undisturbed, marked by modest headstones weathered by time. The exact coordinates of the confrontation site along the Brazos are now uncertain. River shifts and development altered recognizable landmarks. Modern historians reviewing the archival material tend to agree on several points. First, the physical evidence supports a coordinated overpowering of the two hunters rather than a chaotic exchange. Second, no documentation indicates the involvement of additional white accomplices or organized abolitionist networks in that specific encounter. Third, subsequent credible sightings suggest the four men remained alive together for at least several weeks after the killings. Beyond these conclusions lies unresolved terrain. Did they remain together long-term or separate for safety? Did they adopt new identities immediately or continue traveling under assumed trust within isolated labor networks? Did all four survive the journey northward, or did attrition reduce their number beyond what records captured? The absence of conclusive answers is not unusual for frontier-era cases. What distinguishes this file is the inversion at its center. In 1856, in a wooded corridor near the Brazos River, the expected trajectory of pursuit failed. The enslaved were not retrieved. The armed pursuers did not return. The final surviving official note, written in steady ink before the file was archived, reads simply, "No further actionable leads." After that line, silence. Not a dramatic silence, but a bureaucratic one. Paper closed, shelf assigned, attention redirected. And yet the quiet endurance of scattered references across decades suggests something else persisted beneath the paperwork. Four men stepped beyond the legal definition imposed upon them. Two men entered the woods to restore that definition by force. Only one side of that confrontation lies beneath marked graves. The rest moved into uncertainty, carrying rifles taken from those who hunted them, traveling through a landscape that offered danger but also distance. The case remains inactive. The outcome remains incomplete. And along the shifting banks of the Brazos, no physical trace explains how, in October 1856, a manhunt ended with the hunters left behind. By the early 1890s, nearly 4 decades removed from the events along the Brazos, the incident no longer existed in living legal memory. The courthouse in Brazos County had undergone renovations. Older documents were transferred into bound volumes, categorized under homicides with incomplete prosecution. The file concerning Gideon Harrow and Thomas Kearley occupied fewer than 30 pages. Sparse witness accounts, inventory lists, a brief field sketch of the riverbank. No sketches of suspects, no confirmed identifications beyond the 4 names listed in plantation records. Yet outside official custody, memory behaved differently. In 1893, a schoolteacher in Central Texas began collecting local oral histories for a regional publication. Among ranchers and farm families, she encountered a recurring reference to the turned hunt. The phrasing varied, but the structure of the story remained consistent. 4 enslaved men fleeing north, 2 mounted pursuers, a confrontation in timber near the Brazos River, the hunters found dead, the fugitives never recaptured. When she attempted to corroborate details through county offices, she located the original report. What struck her most was not what the file contained, but what it lacked. No testimony from enslaved individuals recorded voluntarily. No diagrams of the exact campsite layout beyond a rough boundary note. No inventory of the missing rifles beyond serial markings. The story as preserved in law was skeletal. In 1895, an aging former deputy who had ridden briefly with Sheriff Mercer during the early stages of the search offered a more textured recollection. His account, recorded informally in a notebook now preserved in a private archive, described the forest that week as unusually still. He recalled that the posse found no signs of chaotic retreat. Instead, he said, it was as if whoever left did so on their own time. He elaborated on a detail absent from the official report. Impressions in the soil suggesting that after the confrontation, at least one of the 4 men had walked deliberately back toward the original campsite before heading north. The deputy believed this indicated retrieval of supplies, food, blankets, perhaps ammunition. It contradicted the assumption of immediate flight. If accurate, that pause is significant. It suggests control of the scene after the violence concluded. It suggests time sufficient to think, to gather, to choose direction. During the same decade, the son of Thomas Kearley, now a middle-aged ranch hand, reportedly visited the burial site of his father each October. Family accounts state that he carried with him the bent rifle barrel recovered months after the killing, which had eventually been returned to the family. He is said to have examined it silently, running his hand along the warped metal. He left no written reflection. By 1901, the physical site of the confrontation had become difficult to pinpoint. Seasonal flooding altered the Brazos banks repeatedly, erasing earlier landmarks. Timber harvesting changed the tree line. New settlers fenced parcels of land once considered open frontier. The depression where the bodies were found no longer existed in recognizable form. Still, fragments persisted in communities north of Texas. A 1903 cattle drive journal from a rancher operating near the Oklahoma border mentioned hearing a quiet older black man known only as Ben Carter. The rancher noted that Carter handled firearms with unusual familiarity and avoided discussions about his past. The name alone proves nothing. Carter was not uncommon. But the journal entry described him as having a scar across his left forearm from iron injury long ago. Plantation iron restraints often left such marks. In 1908, an interview conducted with a formerly enslaved woman living in Indian Territory included a brief passage. There were 4 who said they would not go back. They said if the woods closed, they would close too. The interviewer did not pursue clarification. The comment stands isolated, a line among many recollections of bondage and flight. As the 20th century advanced, historians began re-examining antebellum records more systematically. In the 1930s, during the Works Progress Administration's efforts to document slave narratives, Several elderly interviewees referenced armed resistance during escapes. While none explicitly named the Brazos incident, one narrative described 4 men who took the hunters' guns and walked north under moonlight. The storyteller claimed this occurred before the war, in Texas. Without names or dates, the parallel remains suggestive. Modern archival review confirms certain constants. The iron shackles recovered at the scene were preserved in county storage until the 1920s, when they were cataloged as miscellaneous artifacts. Their hinge pins, when examined decades later by a historian specializing in restraint devices, displayed signs of prior tampering consistent with repeated testing. Whether the tampering occurred before or during the final encounter cannot be conclusively determined. The ballistic characteristics of mid-19th century rifles complicate forensic certainty. However, powder burn descriptions in the 1856 report indicate discharge at close range, within several feet. Combined with Kearley's wrist bruising and fractured jaw, and Harrow's broken mandible, the evidence continues to support the sequence. Physical overpowering first, controlled shooting second. One theory occasionally advanced in later scholarship suggests that the hunters may have attempted negotiation before violence escalated. Harrow's final notebook line, "They are learning," could imply recognition of strategic thinking among the escapees. If so, a standoff rather than an immediate ambush is plausible. Perhaps words were exchanged. Perhaps terms were proposed and rejected. The record offers no transcript, only outcome. The broader historical climate must also be considered. In 1856, national tensions over slavery intensified following violent clashes in other territories. News traveled slowly but steadily even to remote regions. Enslaved individuals were not isolated from awareness of resistance elsewhere. Communication networks, quiet, indirect, existed across plantations. Knowledge of geography, patrol patterns, and weaknesses in enforcement circulated discreetly. By 1910, the last direct descendants of those immediately involved were aging. The case had transformed from active tragedy to inherited legend. Among white descendants of the hunters, it was remembered as a grim episode of frontier danger. Among black communities whose ancestors endured bondage in the region, it carried different weight, a rare documented reversal of power. In 1924, a regional newspaper published a retrospective column on unsolved crimes of early Texas. The article devoted 3 paragraphs to the 1856 double killing. It described the fugitives as vanishing into wilderness beyond reach. No further investigation followed. What remains, when stripped of accumulated retellings, is stark. 2 armed men pursued 4 who sought to escape enslavement. Evidence indicates the 4 coordinated effectively, subdued their pursuers, and departed with weapons and supplies. Credible but unconfirmed sightings suggest survival beyond the initial confrontation. No arrest, no trial, no official closure. The case file's final archival note, added in 1931 during recataloguing, reads, "Status: unresolved, historical interest. Time has rendered the river unrecognizable. Timber once thick has been cleared and regrown. Roads cut across land where horses once tracked carefully between trees. The depression in the earth where the bodies were found has long since leveled." But the structure of the event remains intact in documentation. A pursuit reversed, authority interrupted, silence maintained. 4 men stepped into forest under the risk of capture or death. 2 followed under the assumption of control. The confrontation ended not with shackles closed, but with them left unused on the ground. Beyond that moment, the archive does not follow. It stops at the riverbank, at the bodies, at the bent rifle barrel buried downstream. And in that stopping point lies the enduring weight of the case, not in spectacle, not in myth, but in the measured fact that in October 1856, along a quiet stretch of Texas timber, the expected outcome failed, and those who were meant to disappear did not. In the decades after the newspaper column of 1924 briefly revived public awareness, the file returned once more to obscurity. It remained housed in a climate-controlled room in the Brazos County Courthouse Annex, cataloged among antebellum homicides. The handwriting on its cover, faded iron gall ink, still read the names Gideon Harrow and Thomas Kearley, October 1856. By mid-century, professional historians began reassessing the structure of slave patrol systems in eastern Texas. Academic interest shifted from isolated crimes to patterns, how patrols operated, how communication traveled between plantations, how resistance manifested beyond recorded uprisings. In that broader context, the Brazos reversal became less anomaly and more data point, rare, but not impossible. A 1952 graduate thesis from a Texas university examined runaway advertisements published between 1850 and 1860. Within that dataset, 4 names from Wilcox Plantation appeared in a single notice dated September 1856. The ad described Sam as literate and observant, Isaiah as broad-shouldered, scar over right eye, Ben as experienced with horses, and Josiah as youthful but determined. The notice offered escalating reward tiers depending on proximity to capture. It made no reference to anticipated violence. The thesis author cross-referenced that advertisement with the 1856 homicide report and concluded cautiously that the fugitives likely acted in coordinated defense rather than spontaneous aggression. The reasoning was procedural. Professional slave hunters rarely traveled without maintaining distance from escapees during approach, especially when outnumbered. For the 4 to have subdued both men suggests either deception, luring them into close proximity, or a negotiated meeting that collapsed. A close reading of Harrow's final notes offers subtle support for the latter possibility. They split and rejoin. Signal patterns, bird calls. These lines imply observation over time. It suggests the hunters understood they were being studied as well. If the 4 men possessed knowledge of terrain and tracking practices, they could have staged visibility intentionally, drawing the hunters toward a chosen location. In 1968, during heightened national conversations about civil rights and historical accountability, a regional historian revisited the Brazos case publicly. In a lecture delivered in Houston, he described it as one of the few documented reversals in which enslaved fugitives demonstrably gained tactical advantage and disappeared beyond record. He refrained from romanticizing the event. Instead, he emphasized its documentary weight: 2 dead pursuers, no recapture, subsequent credible sightings. Archival re-examination in the 1970s uncovered a small but telling artifact: a folded scrap of paper preserved between Harrow's notebook pages. The paper bore partial arithmetic, divisions of distance and time. On the reverse side, faint pencil markings appeared to outline a bend in the Brazos River with a notation: shallow, rock base. Whether Harrow drew this himself or copied information gathered locally remains uncertain, but it suggests the hunters anticipated a crossing point. If the fugitives knew that anticipation, they could have exploited it. During the same period, oral historians collecting testimonies from descendants of formerly enslaved families in central Texas encountered recurring references to a phrase: the October 4. The phrase appeared disconnected from specific names, but connected consistently to a story of armed self-defense in wooded terrain. In these accounts, the emphasis was not on killing but on refusal to be taken back alive. The sociological significance of that framing is notable. In white settler retellings, the event often centered on the shock of the hunters' deaths. In black community memory, the focus shifted toward agency and escape. Both interpretations stem from the same physical outcome, yet assign meaning differently. In 1985, a detailed forensic-style review was conducted using modern analytical frameworks applied retrospectively to the 1856 documentation. Scholars examined descriptions of wound angles, binding marks, and environmental context. Their reconstruction proposed the following sequence as most plausible. The four fugitives identified the hunter's approach, likely through auditory signals, dogs, tack movement, or deliberate scouting. They selected a location bordered by marsh and timber to limit mounted mobility. A controlled encounter occurred at the campsite. The hunters were drawn into close proximity, possibly under the pretense of surrender or negotiation. Physical force was used to incapacitate them quickly, fractured jaw, wrist binding. Firearms were then confiscated. The final shots were delivered at close range, likely to ensure no renewed pursuit. This reconstruction remains hypothetical, yet it aligns closely with physical evidence preserved in the original report. In the 1990s, environmental historians mapped historical river movements along the Brazos corridor. Their data confirmed that between 1860 and 1900, several major floods significantly altered banks and forest density near the presumed site of the confrontation. The physical depression where the bodies were found would almost certainly have been erased within a generation. Any buried artifacts not recovered in 1856 would have been displaced or submerged. What then persists? The bent rifle barrel, preserved by Kearley's descendants, was donated to a regional museum in 1998. Metallurgical analysis indicated the bend was deliberate and applied with sustained force, not the result of impact during struggle. This suggests the weapon was intentionally disabled after use. Whether as practical precaution or symbolic act cannot be determined. The iron shackles, catalogued decades earlier as miscellaneous hardware, were re-examined in 2004. Microscopic inspection revealed repetitive scoring on one hinge pin consistent with testing using a narrow metal implement. The wear predated the final confrontation, based on corrosion layering. This detail strengthens the possibility that at least one of the fugitives had prior access to restraints and studied them in preparation for escape. No direct descendant of Sam, Isaiah, Ben, or Josiah has ever surfaced with documented lineage tied conclusively to the Wilcox plantation escape. This absence does not eliminate survival. Name changes and migration patterns in the late 19th century complicate genealogical tracing. In 2012, a digital archive project scanned the original 1856 file, making it publicly accessible. For the first time, researchers worldwide could examine Mercer's steady script, the rough sketch of the riverbank, the inventory list of missing rifles. The scan reveals something understated but striking. The final page contains no expression of outrage, no moral commentary, only procedural closure. Perpetrators not apprehended, case inactive. That line, written in 1857, has not been amended. The event exists now at the intersection of documented fact and measured inference. It resists embellishment. There is no diary from the four fugitives, no confession, no recorded reunion decades later confirming survival. There are only traces, consistent, repeated, but incomplete. In October 1856, in timber near the Brazos River in Texas, 4 enslaved men fled forced labor. 2 professional pursuers tracked them. Physical evidence indicates the 4 gained control of the encounter, restrained and shot the hunters, reclaimed supplies, and departed northward. Subsequent credible reports suggest they traveled together for weeks, possibly months. After that, the archive falls silent. The silence is not empty. It is structured by what remains. The unused shackles, the bent rifle barrel, the fractured jaw, the tied dogs left alive, the arithmetic scribbled on a folded scrap of paper. History often preserves power in abundance and resistance in fragments. Here, the fragments endure with unusual clarity. The forest no longer holds the campsite. The river has shifted its banks. Generations have passed. But the measured record of that October confrontation remains intact. A manhunt began with expectation of capture. It ended with 2 graves and 4 men unaccounted for. No further action taken.